A newly appointed police chief enters his precinct in disguise, hoping to see his officer's true colors. But when a white officer spits in his face, assuming he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will change everything. The scorching wind swept through the small streets of Blue Ridge, carrying the stifling heat of a summer morning. On the road leading to the police station, cars rushed by, leaving behind the sound of honking horns mixed with hurried footsteps of pedestrians. David Carter sat still in his car, gripping the steering wheel lightly. Through the windshield, he looked at the building in front of him, the Blue Ridge Police Department, the place he was about to take over. This wasn't his first leadership role, but this time, something felt heavier. He adjusted the rearview mirror and looked at himself. A middle-aged man with sharp eyes and weathered skin. He wasn't wearing the distinguished uniform of a police chief. Instead, he wore a faded plaid shirt, old jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. Everything was intentional. David didn't want cautious glances or rehearsed handshakes. He wanted to see the true face of this police department, not through polished reports, but through how they treated someone they deemed unimportant. He exhaled deeply, then opened the car door and stepped out. The concrete pavement beneath his feet was scorching, radiating heat from the asphalt, but David felt nothing except the weight of his mission. Outside the station, a few officers gathered near the parking lot, chatting and laughing. Others were discussing work. No one paid attention to him. A few eyes glanced his way, but no greetings, no questions. Just a hint of wariness, a silent divide between those who wore the badge and those who didn't. David walked slowly, absorbing the atmosphere. Something was off, an invisible tension, an unspoken barrier. He had already seen the first signs. Stepping through the glass doors, he officially entered the place that, in just a few hours, he would call his department. But right now, with everything he had witnessed so far, he saw a place that desperately needed change. The scent of stale coffee and damp paper lingered in the air of the Blue Ridge Police Department. Laughter echoed from a corner where a group of officers had gathered, some leaning against desks, others casually chatting about recent arrests. David walked slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. No one paid him much attention. If they did, it was only with brief, assessing glances. He didn't care. Then a sharp voice cut through the background noise. "Hey, what the hell are you doing here?" David turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man striding toward him. His name tag read Marcus Reynolds, and the smirk on his face was one of pure amusement, laced with condescension. David didn't answer right away. He simply met Marcus's gaze, reading the man in front of him, the face of someone who was used to power, used to never being questioned. "You lost or something?" Marcus sneered. A few other officers nearby perked up, their curiosity piqued. David opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. "Listen, old man, you need to know your place. This is a police station, not a homeless shelter." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Someone muttered something about another vagrant wandering in. David remained still. He didn't flinch, didn't react. That seemed to irritate Marcus. He took a step closer, voice dropping to a harsher tone. "Are you deaf? Get out!" And then, with the same smug expression, he spat at David's feet. The room fell into a stunned silence. A few officers stifled laughter, others exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. Marcus, however, stood tall, arms crossed, completely satisfied with himself. David inhaled slowly. He could feel the heat rising to his face, not from shame, but from the undeniable proof of a toxic culture that had been left unchecked for far too long. He didn't retaliate. Not yet. Instead, David simply held Marcus's gaze for a long, piercing moment, then turned and walked away. No one in that room knew that the man they had just mocked was about to change their world forever. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the lingering laughter in the precinct. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately." Groans and sighs filled the air as officers reluctantly set down their coffee cups, pushed back their chairs, and made their way toward the large meeting hall. Some grumbled about another pointless briefing, others speculated on what it might be about. Marcus walked in with his usual swagger, arms crossed as he leaned casually against the wall. The man they had laughed at, the man Marcus had spat at, was the man now standing at the front of the room, their new boss. David let the silence linger before he finally spoke. I came here to see the truth for myself. And I have. The room was suffocatingly silent. Marcus stood frozen, his normally smug expression wiped clean. The confidence that had oozed from him just moments ago had vanished, replaced by something else, fear. The other officers weren't much better. Some looked down at their hands, avoiding eye contact. Others stole uneasy glances at Marcus, as if waiting for him to say something, to do something. But for the first time, Marcus had no words. David stood at the podium, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. But somehow that made everything worse. He exhaled slowly, his voice steady, but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. This morning, I walked into this precinct as an outsider, and what I saw confirmed everything I feared. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. A police department is supposed to stand for justice, for integrity, for honor. His voice remained calm, but each word hit like a hammer. It represents the trust people place in us, the belief that we are here to serve, not to demean, not to humiliate. David let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning his gaze to Marcus. And then he took a step forward. But what I witnessed today, he continued, locking eyes with the man who had so carelessly disrespected him, was an officer who believes that a badge gives him the right to treat people however he pleases. That power makes him untouchable. Marcus's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wanted to fight back, to say something, but he couldn't, because David was right. David took another step closer. When you spat at me, Marcus, he said, his voice dropping just enough to make the words hit harder. You weren't just spitting at me. You spat on this badge. You spat on your oath. You spat on the very foundation of what this department should stand for. The silence in the room deepened. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth, desperate to explain, to justify, but what excuse could he possibly give? David's expression didn't change. For that reason, effective immediately, you are suspended. An internal investigation will follow. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Marcus's face turned red. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked around, searching for support, but found none. David's voice, steady and unwavering, rang through the room one final time. And if you think you can get away with this, you are mistaken. Marcus stood there, shoulders stiff, his downfall unfolding before everyone. For the first time in his career, he had no control, and he knew it. After the tense meeting, the atmosphere in the Blue Ridge Police Department shifted immediately. Officers who had once laughed alongside Marcus now avoided David's gaze. They returned to their desks in silence, though unease still hung in the air. Some whispered in hushed voices, others struggled to process what had just happened. Marcus was gone, but the shadow of his actions lingered. David stood in the hallway, watching the precinct with a keen eye. He knew suspending one officer wouldn't fix a broken system overnight, but it sent a message, a clear, undeniable signal that change was here, and it wasn't optional. That afternoon, Captain Ryder walked into David's office, his expression unreadable. So, you really mean to follow through with this? Ryder asked, though there was no challenge in his tone, only curiosity, maybe even a hint of respect. David met his gaze without hesitation. Ryder, if we don't take this seriously, who will? Ryder let out a heavy breath, then nodded. All right, what's your plan? David didn't hesitate. He reached for a thick folder on his desk and laid it out. A full personnel review, not just Marcus, but any officer with a history of misconduct or excessive complaints. Mandatory retraining on ethics and community relations, not just a formality, but a real effort to change perspectives. An anonymous reporting system allowing officers to speak up about misconduct without fear of retaliation. Restoring trust with the community police should protect, not intimidate. That had to change. Ryder scanned the documents before nodding slowly. You know this won't be easy, David. David gave a small, knowing smile. I never expected it to be. 3 days later, the first training session began. As David stepped into the room, some officers looked skeptical, others outright annoyed. But among them, one pair of eyes held something different: determination. A young officer, Elena Foster, hesitated before raising her hand. "I've been silent for too long," she said firmly, "but I want to do what's right." And in that moment, David knew change had begun. No one believed that Marcus would go down quietly. 3 days after his suspension, he filed a formal complaint with the city council, accusing David of abuse of power, discrimination, and personal bias. The news spread like wildfire. Inside the precinct, the tension grew even thicker. Some officers secretly supported Marcus, believing his punishment had been too harsh. Others remained silent, waiting to see how things would unfold. David wasn't surprised. He knew that every reform comes with resistance. But instead of rushing to defend himself, he decided to let the truth speak for itself. That night, David sat in his office, the dim light casting shadows over the thick file in front of him. Marcus Reynolds's disciplinary record. More than 10 complaints from civilians, excessive force, discrimination, and even documented evidence of unnecessary aggression during arrests. But the most damning part? No one in leadership had ever held him accountable. They had covered for him. They had ignored the reports, justifying his actions because he was effective at controlling crime. The next morning, David called Captain Ryder into his office. "We're making this public," he said, sliding the file across the desk. Ryder frowned. "Are you sure? This will stir up a storm." David met his gaze without hesitation. "Sometimes a storm is exactly what's needed to clear out the rot." Ryder was silent for a long moment. Then he took the file and nodded. 2 days later, the internal report on Marcus was released. The media caught on quickly. People who had suffered under Marcus's abuse began coming forward. Public outrage followed, with citizens demanding answers not just about Marcus, but about the entire department's past failures. And as for Marcus, his appeal was immediately denied. He wasn't just suspended, he was fired. Permanently. But it wasn't just about him anymore. The officers who had protected him were also placed under review. The wall of silence had been shattered, and David knew the real battle was just beginning. After Marcus's file was made public, the atmosphere inside the Blue Ridge Police Department changed significantly. Officers who had once backed him now kept their heads down or left the force altogether. Some were placed under investigation for covering up misconduct, while others resigned before facing scrutiny. Those who remained knew one thing for certain: the old era was over. If they wanted to stay, they had to be part of a department that valued accountability over blind loyalty. But David understood that the real fight wasn't just within the precinct, it was outside, in the hearts of the people. 1 week later, David attended a community meeting at the town's cultural center. The hall was packed, but the crowd wasn't welcoming. Mistrust hung heavy in the air. The people in that room weren't here to celebrate, they were here to challenge. David stood at the front, taking in the wary faces. He hadn't come with a prepared speech, no rehearsed words of reassurance. He took a deep breath and spoke plainly. "I know you don't trust us, and I don't blame you." A deep silence settled over the room. "I'm not here to ask for blind faith. I'm here to tell you that things will not be the same." A woman in the front row crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "We've heard that before." David nodded. "I understand, and I won't ask you to believe me based on words alone. Trust isn't built with promises, it's built with action." The tension in the room softened just a little. People leaned in, listening. Then a young boy, no older than 10, hesitantly stepped forward from the front row. He looked up at David with wide, uncertain eyes. "Are you really the police chief?" David knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Yes, I am." The boy bit his lip before speaking softly. "My dad says the police don't care about us." The room fell into a complete hush. David studied the boy for a moment, then responded in a steady, sincere voice. "I can't change the past, but I promise things will be different from now on." The boy blinked, his expression shifting just slightly, a tiny crack in the wall of doubt. And in that moment, David knew that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But this was the first step. 1 year later, the Blue Ridge Police Department was no longer the place David Carter had walked into on that first day. The officers who refused to change had left. Some were fired, others resigned. But those who remained, they were the ones who believed in a new way of policing, in accountability and respect. The community had changed too. There was still hesitation, still caution. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Years of mistreatment didn't just disappear because of a few policy changes, but people had started to open up. The anger wasn't as immediate, the fear wasn't as visible. There were still challenges, but now there was a willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, things really were different. One late evening, David stood outside the precinct, watching as officers clocked out for the day. He listened to their laughter, not the mocking, degrading kind he had once heard, but genuine camaraderie. A year ago, that sound didn't exist here. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air settle around him. His job wasn't done. The work of rebuilding, of earning trust, of reshaping a culture, it was far from over. There would still be struggles, still be resistance. But as he looked around, seeing the faces of those who had chosen to stay, officers who now carried their badges with pride, not arrogance, he knew one thing for certain. He was on the right path. David allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Change is never easy, but it is always worth it. Change is never easy, but it always starts with one courageous action. Sometimes, to fix a broken system, we must face resistance, doubt, and even personal sacrifice. But if we stay committed to our principles, we can make a difference. Respect, fairness, and accountability are not just values for work. They are the foundation of every meaningful relationship in life. Dare to stand up, dare to make things right, and dare to create change for a better environment.